And then like when you get to the other side and you're like, I need long-term care, decisions have to be made. Peggy talked about it. There is fear around it. Nobody wants to go to a home. You want to have control over it. Having control over it means understanding your options. We talked about a lot of complicated things today. Knowing your options is going to help you make a decision about what it is that you want. And then you can determine how it is you're going to pay for it.
Welcome to One Went the Other Way, a podcast about your journey and finances. I'm your host, James. Today we have Peggy and Wanda with us. Today's topic of discussion is long-term care. Complicated subject to say the least, but I think it'd be good to have some financial advisors weigh in.
In our podcast, we have a very young person, and then we have some older people, and me potentially staring right in the face of long-term care, especially if I keep having bike accidents. But when we're prepared for the topic, James, I think you had some really good questions regarding this.
In looking at assessing your needs and understanding your options, I think the first kind of question is, what kind of options do I have regarding insurance to help me cover long-term care?
Yes, insurance is one option for long-term care. And I think that we should really also discuss things like Medicare does not pay for long-term care. And I think that people don't realize that. So when you start talking about what are the options, what do I need, that kind of thing. So you have to look at, okay, what's available to you, right? How would you pay for long-term care, right? So Medicare's out because it doesn't cover long-term care, right? You can have insurance, which you can purchase, long-term care insurance. You can pay for it out of your investments and your retirement accounts, right? Because that's long-term care. If you have an HSA, that would be a qualified medical expense at this point. I mean, unless the rules change, but generally speaking, I'm pretty sure that long-term care is going to stay on the list of qualified expenses for an HSA. And then, I mean, are there any other options? Oh, Medicaid.
Yeah.
But then that means that you have to have already exhausted your other resources.
Right. But the 4 options, I'm going to add the 5th one, which a lot of people do, because those are the 4 options you talk about. The 5th option is relying on a family member, which many people do.
Forgot about that.
Which may be very stressful to all involved, I think.
Yeah. So, it's actually horrible to do that to your family in general. Because
I think so.
We can have that discussion later, but there is a whole lot of research on what being a caregiver does to the well-being of the family member who's giving the care.
To include the person who is giving the care, statistically will pass away shortly after the person because of the toll it takes on the health of the person doing the care. There are basically 3 types of long-term care facilities. There are those that are privately paid for, right? You must write a check in order to stay in those places. And then the other side of the spectrum is those that are subsidized by the state. And those are generally for destitute. And so those are going to be 100% subsidized by the state. And then facilities are in that middle range where they take so many destitute cases. And for this, they are given some kind of reimbursement by the government. So it's somewhere in that middle range. Very important to look at a long-term care facility to see which category it is. And actually, I had a nurse suggest to me that talk to the fire department, because the fire department picks up people as they pass away in long-term care facilities, and they can tell you in your community the quality of care there, because they come at all odd hours, which is an interesting perspective. Just a little gee whiz fact.
Interesting. I didn't even know that. Yeah. So we talked about those options. There's also the other few options of staying in an assisted living versus in-home care as well. Have you had clients deal with that expense as well?
Again, this is going to be the podcast of 3s again, I think. There's 3, right? You can do in-home, assisted living, and then full nursing care. Those are your 3 options.
Let's kind of talk about the expense, because I think that's something we don't want to totally overlook, because, these options aren't economical per se.
No, they're not. So the median, again, this is a state dependent thing, right? The median cost of long-term care is $100K per year. Some states more, some states less, but $100K for planning. And the median time in a long-term care facility, according to the long-term care insurance companies, is about 4 years, the median time. And, you could be more, you could be less. It depends. It really has to do with your morbidity, the things that might cause you to die, and how well they can be controlled in the facility.
And your medical directive, which is a whole nother topic. We'll talk about that.
I know.
later.
We should see another podcast about medical directives. Peggy, you said something like you could pay for it yourself. And one of the interesting things is paying for it, having that cognitive, okay, I'm going to be 1 in 3 chance of being in a long-term care facility. And the number is actually closer to 60% of us will need some kind of care. And I think this has to do more like with that in-home care that you might need, which does cost less per month. And again, could be a whole nother topic unto itself. We could probably have a long-term care nurse come in and talk to us about, I don't know, the nurse, but someone to address in-home care, an in-home care professional, something like a place for mom or something like that. But then you could cognitively look at that 400,000, 100,000 per year and say, I need to support this as part of my retirement planning, because how does this fit into retirement planning? And we talked to retirement income. And so like we were talking about, hey, if you want to have that median standard of living, that's about $60,000 a year for median standard of living. And then long-term care is already exceeding that. And so cognitively, you can say that I'm going to set aside this 400,000 so that this takes care of long-term care, but it means you can't have access to it in your retirement life and retirement income in those boom years. So I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea.
Yeah. And I mean, it depends on your personal wealth, right? I mean, but also it's with all insurance, right? It's the risk versus reward.
And this is actually important when we're talking about insurance. Is it a risk that you want to take, or do you want to give it to the insurance company? And if you want to give it to the insurance company, then you're going to buy long-term care insurance. And when you have long-term care insurance, that industry has developed over the years. Again, as the demographics has changed, it used to be that there was only long-term care insurance, that's it. But the risk is too great to the insurance company to support a guaranteed premium. And it's not one of my favorite places to put a risk. Like for myself, I would not buy a long-term care policy merely because the risk is too high, that the premium will be too high when I need the care and I won't be able to afford it when I'm older. But the industry changes to meet the need. And right now we do have hybrid policies. And the hybrid policy says, I know you have a 1 in 3 chance of going to long-term care. I know you have a 100% chance of dying. So then the insurance company can assess risk and split that risk between the two and then guarantee a premium for the rest of your life. And that becomes a much more palatable option in terms of how much it costs me. I like it because it can guarantee a premium. Okay. It is perhaps a little more expensive because you're insuring 2 things in your life. However, there is comfort in knowing that I have this policy to take care of that need, and then I can use my assets to do whatever I want. Have a good time in my boom years. Yeah. So just a thought, but a complicated topic, and I think one that you need to talk to a professional who's familiar with all the long-term care options that include life insurance hybrids, life insurance with long-term care rider, long-term care annuity, couples, joint. I mean, it goes on.
It does. So, it's very complicated, as all insurance stuff is. So it's very complicated, and it is important to have the conversation because it's a huge financial thing. It's emotional, it's financial, it has to do with your family, and then always, well, I don't know, maybe it's just my own personal thing, but there's that fear of being in a nursing home.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Nobody wants to be there.
Yeah, there's their fear there, and then not having the choices. And I think that having the discussion is going to help you to have more choices. Yeah. Right.
And then you make the choice. Then you make the choice, and then there's less fear around it. This is what's going to happen if I need it.
And then kind of going into the last thing, we were talking about having conversations with your financial advisor about understanding and assessing your needs. But then what are your thoughts on constantly reviewing as your life goes on and as you have new developments?
If you have a long-term care policy, or if you've had the conversation with your financial advisor and you've assessed what you think your needs are today, and maybe you're like in your 30s, right? But as part of your financial plan, you should continue to keep that in there. You should revisit that. Have things changed? Did something happen in your life? Did a medical condition come up that, now you're okay, but 10 or 15, 20 years from now, that might be a problem. You need to keep on talking with your financial advisor. Even if you've already purchased long-term care insurance, you should still have the conversation and reevaluate the insurance. Maybe something new has come out that will be better for you.
Mhm.
So you need to keep having the conversation. Be careful, that you are having the conversation early enough. There are things that will make your long-term care insurance more expensive, right? So it's insurance. So the insurance company is going to evaluate your needs. And if
And
you
your health.
already are to the thing where they're going to say, oh man, in like 5 years, this person's going to need long-term care. Well,
And your
your
health,
long-term
right?
care insurance is going to be very expensive. So, it just needs to be reevaluated as just all of your financial position.
So I kind of think of it like this, right? So when you're very first starting, right, and you're young, not a whole lot of need because it seems so far away. It never happened. And then you start to develop assets, right? And then that's when you want to look at, I have assets and resources, and maybe I need to add long-term care. Depending on your health, but actually depending on your family's health. So most of the time I see it when a parent or a grandparent starts to have a medical issue, and then you really need to evaluate, is that a medical issue that's going to affect you? If there's family members with dementia, then you have to consider that your odds or your probability genetically might be greater that you might have some of these medical conditions. And so I'm addressing that sooner.
This
Yeah.
brings up a great question. So you had even brought up dementia.
Mhm.
How do you prepare if you're not going to be able to make good financial decisions when you're older or you have health problems?
That's a good question. And something else too I thought of. There's a difference between mortality and morbidity. I want to talk to your question too, James. So mortality is I'm going to die and it's going to be instant. A morbidity is it's going to take a long time. So history of stroke, more of a morbidity issue because they can keep you around for a long, long time, right? But a heart attack, there's no black and white. It's not exact. It's a lot of gray. But generally heart attacks, right, can wipe you out right away. It's a mortality issue. Families with morbidity issues, dementia that can go on and on for a long time, maybe bad diabetes, not cared for diabetes can,
Kidney problems, you need
yes, they're
dialysis.
going
Right.
on for a long time. But dialysis is an interesting thing because dialysis apparently immediately qualifies you for Medicaid, for state aid, because it's very expensive. And so it's one of those ones that we catch all. So it's a mortality versus a morbidity issue. And so in the family, when you're looking at a need for long-term care in the review, right, those are things to talk about and consider your health long-term and what kind of issues you might have in your family. They will assess you based on those issues to determine whether or not to give you long-term care insurance, not just can I afford it, but do you have the health and can we take as an insurance company the risk?
Right.
When somebody has dementia, it's too late.
Yes, too late. They're not going to, you need care already. You're to the point, right? So
Too
you're not
late.
going to get it.
Too late.
Right. But that's again, back to James's question a little bit about, well, when you can't make those decisions. Well, that's why you have a medical directive. And
Mhm.
that's part of your overall planning for your future, right? So good estate planning, good financial plan, good insurance type planning, good planning for when or if there's going to be a time in your life you can't make decisions. These are things that you put in place. And, obviously we don't draw up these things, but we can help you, maybe give you some direction, that kind of thing. It's just that's all part of good planning,
Yeah.
is to have these things in place.
Kind of a question on tax implications of long-term care planning, especially when
Mhm.
talking to a financial advisor. How do you make preparations in that area?
Keep in mind that we are not tax professionals, yet tax efficiencies are things that we do look at. And the government tends to encourage things that they want you to do. And one of the things that they want you to do is buy long-term care. So you can actually deduct a part of long-term care premiums within your taxes. So something to consider. And then on the other side, and Peggy said, this is a qualified medical expense. And I'm fairly confident that they will continue to keep it as a qualified medical expense in the future. So that's an important consideration. So looking at it again in your overall financial picture as a sliver, right? When you're younger, and then that becomes more and more important to look at and review as your financial journey goes.
So I just want to mention that yes, there is a possibility that you will be able to deduct your long-term care premiums if you purchase it, because like Wanda said, the government tends to want to encourage you to do these things that they think that you're going to need. However, you need to talk to a tax professional, because there are some regulations in the tax code that limit who can deduct and how much you can deduct.
We briefly touched on this, but about how long-term care and the cost of it affects your retirement plan. You had mentioned that you might have to put away that money earlier and not be able to make the changes in your retirement plan as you age. But what has been your experience as financial advisors and talking with people about setting aside this money, and how, if people want to change their, retirement plan, how does that conversation work?
So the crisis becomes, as a crisis, the emergency, it comes by drip. Nothing ever happens by flood. It comes by drip. It comes when you're in that point, like you start to slow down for most people, right? Sometimes it happens sooner. And then all of a sudden you're finding that you can't quite keep up with keeping the house clean, for example. And then you're like, well, I'm going to get someone to come in and help me. And then you're having a harder time getting to the grocery store. And then you're like, well, and then you're like, well, I don't want to stand over my kitchen sink and, be preparing food. So it starts to happen by drip. And then all of a sudden, the money that you thought you were going to go to, Hawaii with, you're like using it to have someone coming in and helping you doing tasks and chores around the house. You might have mobility issues, and then you might not be able to drive so easily, and you might have issue with your eyes and the DMV. So it happens by drip. When we talk the key concept, it's going to be, this around 400,000, it's, 100,000 a year, this kind of thing. That's at the twilight of that long-term care. That's when you're in that long-term care space versus your life where you're like going along, and then some of these things start to slow you down a little bit. And then in your head, you're thinking, okay, I'm not doing the things that I wanted to do. So it's more of a drip across onto your retirement, not a flood, I think. And then like when you get to the other side and you're like, I need long-term care, decisions have to be made. Peggy talked about it. There is fear around it. Nobody wants to go to a home. You want to have control over it. Having control over it means understanding your options. We talked about a lot of complicated things today. Knowing your options is going to help you make a decision about what it is that you want. And then you can determine how it is you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's better to have the conversation sooner with your financial advisor than later. I think a lot of people, like Wanda said, it starts to come up a lot in our lives when we're dealing with a parent or perhaps an older sibling or, right? So, my personal experience has my mother, right? I mean, my mother lived with my sister for quite some time. And then, we've recently moved her to a assisted living facility. I learned a lot during that time. I mean, we learn a lot as financial advisors going through these journeys with our clients, right? And we also have our personal experience. And we also have resources, and we attend seminars and all of those things. But even with all of that, I still learned a lot about what long-term care is today, what assisted living facilities are today, and memory centers, for instance, that they did not have. When I was a child, they didn't have memory centers. So my mom worked in nursing homes. And I just have this, fear because my mom would take me and, the elderly people there. So I've always had this like, oh, I don't want to do that, And I see my mom and the emotional toll that all that was on my mom. But now there are additional options. So I think knowledge is power.
Yes.
And financial planning gives you more choices, right? And that's what we're about, right? Being able to provide you with the clarity that you need so that you can make the choices that are better for you.
So today we wanted to talk about long-term care, assessing need and understanding the various options that are available to you. The second one was understanding that long-term care, the cost of it is not cheap. So you want to address it sooner rather than later. Talking about it helps you have more control over it. Gives you more clarity. You don't have to make decisions right away, but again, it helps you understanding cost. And then to that point, having regular review of that plan with a financial advisor so that you can stay on top of it. And when you're ready to make decisions, have the information that you need.
Well, thank you, Wanda and Peggy, for being on today's podcast to help provide clarity on this. I know it's a complicated subject. If you're listening and you enjoyed this, you can schedule an appointment with Peggy or Wanda if you'd like. You can find us at financesforreallife.com. You can also stay in touch with us on our podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. I will put in the show notes some of the sources that we have and links to the episodes regarding like HSAs and retirement. So you can follow up on those. Catch us on the next episode. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision.